Okay. Now let us do a recap on the talk that was given last Wednesday, because most of you were obviously not here. And this last talk was quite important if we are exploring the journey of awakening. And we were saying that one of the first steps on this journey is to realize that we are conditioned beings. Our minds have been conditioned from early childhood. And this conditioning is an aspect of the human condition. And it doesn't matter where you're from, what culture you're brought up in, we're all conditioned. For example, in this part of the world, Southeast Asia, you're conditioned with this belief in ghosts and spirits, namely Chinese ghosts and spirits. Whereas where I grew up in the West Indies, on the island of Jamaica, which is just south of Cuba, in case you're wondering where that is. And Cuba is just south of Florida. Maybe you can check Google Map. I was conditioned with the belief in African ghosts and spirits, not Chinese ghosts and spirits. This is why I'm not afraid of Chinese ghosts and spirits. And I learned to overcome the fear of African ghosts and spirits, because I realized that it was just a part of the conditioning in the human mind, in human consciousness. And as you know, the power of the imagination is very strong. And I can even scare myself when I'm alone at night, and I can observe that fear. And then you understand how powerful the imagination is. So we are conditioned. We cannot help it. We're conditioned by the home environment, of course. Begins in the home environment. And then we're conditioned by education, formal education, primary school, secondary school, college, and so on. We're conditioned by language, also by the climate, by food, by the environment. Yeah, we are conditioned by the media. Television, newspapers, radio, and now internet. We cannot escape it unless you're living in a cave or you have the opportunity to go on long retreats where you can get away from internet, television, and even your smartphones. I still don't have a smartphone or a mobile phone. I still use the public phone in Canada because they're still working, believe it or not. I still can put coins, 50 cents, and it works. They're not damaged or vandalized. So when you reflect, you begin to see that we are conditioned beings. And it took me quite a while, in my 20s, when I began this search in India, to realize that I was conditioned, my mind was conditioned. The way I think, of course, language, beliefs, concepts, and so on. And of course, the way we think, the thought process. And one of a very important aspect of conditioning is to understand the thought process. Because as you know, we're thinking most of the time. Thinking dominates consciousness. But with wisdom, with understanding and mindfulness, we learn to put thinking in its right place, in its proper perspective. So it doesn't dominate our consciousness. In other words, we don't have to be thinking all the time. Because when we really investigate the nature of the mind and the nature of dukkha, mental, emotional suffering, you see that thinking is really the cause of 99.99% of our mental, emotional suffering. That's obvious, isn't it? When you begin to observe the mind. And if we don't do that, we spend all our lives pointing fingers outside, blaming others for our problems, for the way we feel. It's very easy, isn't it, to look outside of ourselves and blame others. We can blame the government also, politics. We can blame the economy, and of course we can always blame the weather. In England, because the weather is constantly changing, they like to speak about the weather. And if you don't know what to say to somebody, especially a stranger on the street, or in the bus or the train, the subway, MRT train, you can always speak about the weather. Because it's something that we all have in common. So unfortunately, we are not taught to understand what thinking is. We're only taught subjects. And of course we are encouraged, sometimes with the element of fear, unfortunately, to study as hard as we can, to pass exams, to be qualified for jobs. And we can become very professional, very proficient in our respective professions. And it is quite interesting how we can become quite professional, quite proficient in whatever we do, but unless we understand ourselves, which is what wisdom is about, self-knowledge, self-understanding, we really remain ignorant and deluded, because that's a part of our conditioning. Our mental defilements are results of our social conditioning. We're conditioned to believe in this sense of self, I, me, mine, which is a very strong condition, as you know, very deep-rooted. And we're conditioned to be deluded, to suffer from delusion. And we're deluded constantly because we're just reacting all the time to what we see, hear, smell, taste, touch, and by what we think and imagine. Now, initially we don't see this or normal habitual reactions as aspects of delusion. But with mindfulness, with reflection, we begin to see this truth. Because we're conditioned with this reactive pattern. We're conditioned to label things, because we have to use language, we have to use labels. For example, I can say, I have 5 fingers. But the word finger is just a label that we're conditioned with. So we need language, just like we need some mathematics, at least basic mathematics. But it is also limited, just like all our knowledge is limited. All our thinking is limited. And we do need to think in daily life, that is obvious, in order to do things, to be practical, to study, to work, to plan, and so on, to write, to communicate. But you find that even when we don't need to think, the mind keeps thinking unnecessarily. Right? We can all relate to that. The mind is like a thinking machine that doesn't know when to be quiet. So we just think too much, and we dissipate a lot of energy. And a lot of this unnecessary thinking makes us very confused. It creates anxiety, worry, fear, regret, and so on. And as you know, very easily thoughts can become very irrational, very negative, very critical, very judgmental. This is why the practice of loving kindness can be very beneficial to overcome negative, critical, judgmental thoughts. Because you know that when you're very angry with someone, or somebody has done something very unpleasant to you, your thoughts become very judgmental, very critical. And we feel very justified in having those thoughts. It's a part of our conditioning. But in the end, it backfires on us, because when we make mistakes, then we become equally very judgmental, very critical of ourselves. And this is why so many people around the world suffer from guilt. And guilt is an aspect of fear. And this is why it is so important, so beneficial, that when we do make mistakes, we have to forgive ourselves for being human. We have to forgive ourselves for being human when we make mistakes, because we are not perfect. But somehow we think we should be perfect. That's again an aspect of our delusion. For some reason we think we should be perfect, because we cling to ideals, ideas, concepts, beliefs, and so on. But we are human beings and we are not perfect. So you can say it is perfectly natural to make mistakes. Perfectly natural. So we have to forgive ourselves, be kind to ourselves. And as you know, sometimes it's easier to forgive others than to forgive ourselves. And so we torture ourselves. So again, the practice of loving kindness to ourselves and to others is very beneficial indeed. And of course we try to learn from those mistakes. What can I learn from this? Likewise, when we're having some difficulty, challenges in life, instead of being really upset and being quick to, again, point fingers and blame others, it's very beneficial if we just come back to that mindfulness, that stillness, and just reflect, what can I learn from this? What can I learn from this? Instead of blaming others or blaming ourselves, what can I learn from this? And that's an aspect of wisdom, of intelligence. As an aspect also of humility. Because when we are humble, we have the ability to learn. And to learn is one of the aspects of intelligence. Intelligence is not just being smart or having, degrees and have the ability to get high marks in exams. That's one aspect of intelligence, but it's only one aspect. But really, a more important aspect of intelligence is the ability to learn. And you say to yourself, I really don't know. That's a very intelligent thing. Because the ego, which tends to have pride, arrogance, conceit, likes to say, I know, right? Sometimes when I have a discussion with somebody, especially somebody who's read many, many books, they tend to have this intellectual conceit. I know everything. And you can be sure that when somebody says, I know, or I know everything, you can see that they have very little wisdom. They might have a lot of intellectual knowledge, so many facts in their minds, but they don't have wisdom. Because wisdom is not about knowledge. It's not based on thinking and believing. You can believe anything you like, so many different beliefs, endless, countless beliefs, but that is not wisdom. Rather, wisdom comes from questioning, investigating, and understanding. Not just intellectual understanding, but intuitive knowing in the heart. So then the Dhamma, the truth of the Dhamma, comes from the heart. So that is wisdom. To understand. And when we understand, we don't have to believe. And we don't have to waste time arguing with people who love to argue, who love to show off their knowledge. Wisdom is being accepting who you are and seeing things as they are, seeing what's what without reacting to it. Our minds are conditioned to react, our brains are programmed, educated to label, compare, judge, criticize, condemn, to like or dislike, to want or not to want, to hate, to have ill will, resentment, jealousy, and so on. So this is the cause of our conflicts, discontentment, disharmony, and dis-ease. The idea of a permanent, unchanging ego center or self is strengthened by this conditioning. And it is this deep-rooted illusion of a permanent and separate ego entity which is the source and cause of our problems and conflicts, fears and worries and insecurities, craving, greed, and attachments. Normally, we see the world with our conditioned minds. Our view of the world is colored by our judgments and discriminations, or likes and dislikes, or desires and aversions, or hopes and fears, or worries and anxieties. So our perception of reality is limited by our mental states, by how we see and react to the world. Rarely do we see the world with a calm, clear mind. Rarely do we see things as they are with clear awareness or attention. The restless, untrained mind is vulnerable to circumstances. It is easily affected by changing conditions. Sometimes good or pleasant things happen and the mind is happy. Sometimes bad or unpleasant things happen and the mind gets upset. There is suffering, dis-ease. Our state of mind depends on how we react to things or situations. It can remain cool and calm or become heated and upset, depending on how personally we take things. One who follows the path of mindfulness has less fear and anxiety. One can be calm and patient despite the changes and accidents around him or her, because one sees things as they are, impermanent, uncertain, and empty of self. Although there are problems in life, one can be calm and patient without anger or resentment. Being impatient and angry or irritable does not remove the problem. It only causes more suffering and makes the problem worse. With patient endurance, wisdom and determination, dukkha is overcome and the mind becomes peaceful. One is light-hearted, optimistic and free, not gloomy and depressed. So what is thinking? Thinking, which is based on our conditioning, as we mentioned, is based on three things in the mind: memory, past experience, and knowledge, information. Memory, past experience, and information. And if you observe your mind, you can see this, how thinking is intricately related to memory. Right? This is why it's so easy to remember something. And past information is related to memory. Past experience. And of course, knowledge, information, that is stored in the brain. You can see this. And you can say that every time we think, we're recycling the information that's stored in the mind. You can observe this in yourself. And every day we're adding more information to the mind. You can see that the mind is like a computer. So our minds have been programmed, so to speak. And the human brain computer has invented electronic computers, Microsoft, IBM, etc., because the brain computer wants to make copies of itself. Just reflect on that for a moment. The brain computer wants to make copies of itself. The only difference is that the brain computer is much, much more complex than anything we could possibly make. Although the Americans and the Japanese and the Germans and the Taiwanese, etc., are really trying hard to copy the brain as much as possible. But the brain is extremely, extremely complex because it's the result of millions and millions of years of biological evolution. And that's why the Buddha had to train his mind and to understand the entire complexity of the conditioning that we human beings are subject to. So again, thinking is based on the past information that's stored in the brain, and that includes languages, of course. And then it has that ability to project itself in the future. You can see that very obviously in the mind. You can say that thinking is a movement in time. It's moving from past to future, past to future. You can see this happening in your own mind. That's just the nature of the conditioning, the conditioned mind. And that's why we're conditioned with this idea of time, past and future. And that includes anniversaries, birthdays, and so on. Even Chinese New Year is a result of this conditioning. And the self, the idea of who we are, is created by this thought process. So the idea of self is related to memory, to past experience and to information. And of course, because we have to use language, we have to use the label I, or the equivalent of I in other languages. I, you, he, she, and so on. And because we're using the same label I to communicate, it gives the impression in the mind, in consciousness, that this I never changes. It feels permanent. Because we keep saying I all the time. I wonder if you see this. And in one day, you can use this I maybe between 200 to 300 times. And that's why it seems so rock solid and everlasting. We may see changes happening around us all the time, but this I never changes. Because of this constant use of the same label, I. It gives that impression in consciousness that it is really concrete. And this I somehow feels separate. When you don't have awareness, this I feels separate from the rest of society. And it feels separate from nature also. This is why many people today, even when they're in the natural environment and they're busy thinking, they do not feel a part of nature. They feel separate. And very quickly, they get bored. I'd rather be at home or in a shopping center. Because now I'm very attached to all my electronic gadgets. And I have to keep checking my mobile phone for messages. So that's a part of our condition today. Now, one of the delusions we have, as we mentioned, is that habit of reacting all the time. We say that, oh, that's nice, that's not so nice, that's beautiful, that's ugly. I like this, I don't like that. This is tall, this is short, This is better than that one, this one is better than that one. Comparing. And then when you start to compare yourself with another, then you have conflict, don't you? This conditioning of comparison is very unhealthy. And say if your parents compare you with your other siblings, you can see the conflict and how bad it feels too. Your brother, your sister, is much better than you, and they're doing much better in school. How do you feel? Terrible. Or your parents compare you to other children, maybe your relatives, or the neighbor's children is like this. And some teachers even compare other students. And that's very unhealthy. And then when you start comparing yourself with another, then you create a lot of conflict in the mind. And most people experience inferiority complex, right? I'm not as good as that person, or I'm not as successful, I'm not as attractive, or I'm not as popular as the other person. Or what I'm wearing, the clothes I'm wearing, or the car I'm driving, is not as good or beautiful or flashy as the other person's. And that creates inferiority complex. And at the same time, it creates the craving to become. When we compare, we're caught in becoming. The craving to be as successful, as attractive, as brighter, more academic, etc., as the other person. The craving to become, we call it the craving to become. On rare occasions, a few individuals will feel superior to the other, but most people will feel inferior. Yeah. But what is interesting, even the individuals who feel superior experience conflict, because behind that pride, that superiority complex, is fear and insecurity. Because the very fact that we have an image of ourselves, whether it's inferior or superior, there is fear. There is fear. Perhaps next Sunday I can go into the nature of fear, because that's a very interesting topic that we can all relate to. And as you know, there are many types of fears we have. Basically, there's physical fear and mental, psychological fear. And that's a part of our conditioning. And you find that the more modern we become, and we become attached to so many modern things, and our lives become more comfortable, on the physical level, mentally, we experience more, not only attachments and so on, but we experience more fears. And also we experience more isolation and loneliness. As they say, the most lonely people are people in big, crowded cities. It's very true. Whereas in, a kampong, rural environment, people have less fear and less insecurity. And there's a stronger sense of community. Now you can be, you can experience a part of nature and feel that you're a part of the environment. You're not isolated, you're not different from nature. So it is this habit we have of reacting which is a part of our dukkha, when we react. Because it is our reactions that throw us off balance, which makes us upset, or nervous or fearful. So one of the essential teachings of the Buddha on the path to awakening is how not to react. It's a very challenging teaching. When you see, just see. When you hear, just hear. Sounds simple, but it's not easy to practice. But when we practice and we learn to react less and less, you begin to feel the benefits of it. Because we are reacting all the time. Generally, our problems are the result of our inner reaction to a situation. When we do not know ourselves clearly, we are like foreigners to our senses and thoughts and feelings, and it is difficult to control our reactions. It is our reactions that make us burn out, which throws us off balance and causes us suffering or discontent. Our very lack of awareness has contributed to our mental suffering. We are deluded by our thoughts, feelings and emotions, and we become victims of them and are thrown off balance. We can learn to rely on ourselves by paying attention to our patterns of response and becoming aware of the motivations that lead us into difficulty. We can learn to watch and let go, just see things as they are. Things get better in our lives when we react less and less. We can remain calm and peaceful, wise and patient, strong and secure. Basically, our problem is that we take everything too personally. Whether it's in the past, present or future, we tend to relate to them from the context of I, me and mine. We don't realize that ultimately nothing really belongs to us. If you take a walk in the cemetery and read the gravestones and reflect on the nature of impermanence, you will see this fact. We ourselves are conditioned and impermanent beings. How can something that is impermanent and has no lasting, fixed and independent self or ego entity own anything in the first place? It's just a temporary condition. Not to mention, too, the things that we supposedly own are also impermanent themselves. So can we see the height of our folly, ignorance and delusion. Due to the conditioned mind, it is easy to stay inside our personal boundaries, our self-centered world, protecting our habits, pleasures and comforts. Another aspect of delusion, it's when our minds become very obsessive. And worrying is a good example of that. Or we said something and we keep remembering it and we keep regretting what we did or what we said. Or sometimes we regret what we didn't do. Or we didn't say. Why didn't I do that? I'm so crazy, I'm so stupid, I should have known better, I should have done it. And if I've done that thing or I've said that thing, things would be much better now. And we all can experience that. We all can relate to that experience of regret. So when our thoughts become very obsessive, very repetitive, you can see that as an aspect of delusion. And you notice that when we're having a problem or a conflict, thoughts become very repetitive. You keep thinking over and over and over this problem or conflict. And the more you keep thinking over and over this problem or a conflict, somehow this problem seems to get bigger and bigger and bigger. Have you noticed that? We have all experienced this. That's just the nature of the conditioning, the conditioned mind. And before you know it, we create this big, big melodrama, right? And guess who is the star of the melodrama? Right? This is why it takes mindfulness. Only thinking, thinking, thinking. Breathing and smiling. Only thoughts. Only impermanent conditions in the mind. And a good way of looking at this aspect of delusion is like you start out with a small flame and you keep adding paper and oil and wood to the flame, and the flame just gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and before you know it, you have this big roaring fire out of control. And we become very, very deluded, very irrational by this power of delusion. We get carried away with our restless minds and chase our thoughts and ideas, or feelings and emotions. We get caught by them, and so we create a lot of problems for ourselves. Some people get totally carried away and do crazy, irrational things, even commit crimes and murder. We're often victims of our own mental, emotional states because we don't know how to watch our minds with awareness and let these mental states go. So that's an aspect of awakening, using mindfulness, awareness, to look at these obsessive thoughts and let them go. Of course, it takes practice. And if emotions get really strong, then that's where you do something like qigong, or anything mindful, yoga, running, rollerblading, anything that you like to do. I have fond memories of being in the forest and just listening to the twittering of birds. Yeah, but you have to go to the forest. You can't get away from mobile phones. I like to recommend in Singapore that you go to the botanical gardens more often. And just quiet the mind and just look at plants and flowers and trees. And just feel the stillness of trees and plants. Because stillness is an aspect of the awakened mind. Because normally our minds are so restless, agitated. And so a perception of the world seems very, very confusing, sometimes very overwhelming, because we are perceiving the world through this agitated state of mind. The world is in a very feverish, agitated state. The mind changes from like to dislike, from craving to aversion, with the feverishness, agitation of the world. If we can learn to make the mind still, it will be the greatest help to the world. If we can learn to make the mind still, it will be the greatest help to the world. And if you have difficulty stilling your mind, just go to a tree somewhere and hug the tree. You've heard of that, right? Tree hugging. Yes, it's very, very beneficial. And don't worry about what other people will say. Oh, yo, who's watching? I'm crazy now, I'm crazy. I'm hugging trees. But it's one of the best things you can do. And if you don't want to hug a tree, just be with the tree and feel its stillness. Because trees are very still. And plants and flowers. Another aspect of delusion that we can awaken to is the delusion of the mind itself. When thoughts and images are creating so many stories, right? Endless stories and mini dramas. And when we're not mindful, these mind-created stories and mini-dramas, they seem very real, don't they? Right? Very real, very solid, very permanent. In other words, we're deluded by those thoughts and images. But when we bring awareness, mindfulness into the mind, we begin to see that they're only thoughts and images. And that's why that one noting technique can be very helpful. You know that one, thinking, thinking, thinking. Or you can even add, it's only thinking, thinking, thinking. And come back to mindfulness. Because when you do that, it helps us to get out of the story, of the drama. It helps us to free the mind from the contents of those thoughts and images. And you realize it's just thinking. Very beneficial practice. I use this all the time. It's only thinking. Thinking, thinking, thinking. And as you know, with mindfulness, you begin to see that thinking is not permanent, concrete reality. They're just transient, empty conditions. And to be more precise, they're just electrical impulses in the frontal lobe of the brain. Quite amazing. And to think that humans are constantly being deluded by these electrical impulses. But they're just electrical impulses. Only thinking, thinking, thinking. So that's an aspect of awakening. Because thinking is really the main problem in human consciousness. Because it creates our defilements. And it creates the grasping and the clinging aspect to the mind. We grasp and we cling to whatever arises. In other words, we identify with whatever arises. A happy feeling arises and we say, I am happy. We identify with that happy feeling. And when we say, I am happy, initially there is no conflict or dukkha. Why? Because it's pleasant, right? It feels good. But an unhappy feeling arises, and we say, I am unhappy, immediately there is dukkha. There's a conflict in the mind, disturbance. Simply because it is unpleasant. Likewise, I'm upset, I'm afraid, I'm lonely, I'm bored, and so on. But we do that because it's a part of our conditioning. To grasp, to cling, to identify. So again, one of the essential teachings of awakening is not identifying with things, not grasping, not clinging. And actually, if you could put all the Buddha's teaching, all the suttas, think of it, all the suttas, in just one sentence, it would be this: nothing should be grasped at or clung to as me or mine. That is the most essential teaching of all the Buddha's teaching. Nothing should be identified with as I, me, or mine, whether it's physical, mental, or emotional. Because you know, every time you look in the mirror and you see an image, we identify with that image, don't we? And we say, oh, I'm looking good today, or oh, I'm not looking good today. Or getting more wrinkles, more gray hair, or hair is falling out. Or I'm too fat, or I'm too thin. But really, it's an illusion. Or one day you look in the mirror and you say, oh, I'm not too bad today. But then 2 days later, you look in the mirror and say, oh my God, what happened? I need more makeup or something. Or I have to change my brand of cosmetics. Or I need cosmetic surgery. Because this is what a lot of people are doing today. I'm not sure about Singapore, but in other countries, cosmetic surgery is very, very popular, and it's big business. And when we awaken from this delusion of identification, we begin to understand that this body is not me or mine. It belongs to nature. Or you can say it belongs to the changing conditions of nature. And also that image that you see in the mirror, or the image that people see when they look at you, what we call public image, is not who you are. And it's very liberating to realize that. It's not who you are. And this is why it's very healthy, and I was able to experience this for several weeks at a time up in northern India, where I didn't have a mirror, and for many weeks I didn't have an image of what I look like. And it was very healthy when you're not going by this image. And you realize that, all your experience, the way the way you perceive things, your thoughts, your emotions, your state of consciousness, mindfulness, spacious awareness, timelessness, all the things you can experience on a retreat, has nothing to do with this image. And that's why it's good practice, and this is something you can do in Singapore. Cover your mirror for at least 1 day or 2 days. Cover your mirror and see what happens. You feel much better. Alright? Because every time you see that image, ooh. And this is very interesting, this is why most of us don't like photos of ourselves. Have you noticed that? Most of us don't like photos of ourselves. Unless it's very flattering. Oh yeah, I have 20 copies of this one. But the others, oh, terrible. And that's because of that. And also what's interesting, I'm sure you've had this experience where you're feeling really rotten, and you meet a friend, and the friend says, oh, you're looking so nice today. And it's like, what are you talking about? Because they're only seeing an image of you. But how you're feeling is totally different. Very interesting. Yeah. So that's an aspect of awakening, to awaken from this conditioning of identification. And likewise with these mental, emotional states. And this is why in Dhamma practice we learn to objectify these emotions. Instead of saying, say, I am upset or I am angry, you breathe mindfully and you say, there is anger, or there's a state of upset. There's a big difference in saying, I am angry and there is anger. Because when we can objectify a mental state with awareness, there is space. There's some space there. But when we grasp and we identify with something, there's no space in the mind because we're holding on to something that's very personal. You know, my anger, my upset, my problems, my conflicts, and so on. So it's a very useful practice when we begin to awaken. There is fear, or there's boredom, there is loneliness, there is jealousy, there is desire, or there is craving, there is expectation. And you remind yourself, this too shall pass. It is impermanent. These 4 words, this too shall pass, are the greatest wisdom in human experience. This too shall pass. It is impermanent. And it's good to remind ourselves of its changing nature, because when emotions are very strong, they have a feeling of permanency to them. I'm sure you've noticed that. When you're really upset, you think, I'm going to be upset for the rest of my life. Or I'm going to be sad for the rest of my life. Right? You've noticed that. And that's why it's so beneficial when we remind ourselves, this too shall pass. And when emotions are very strong, it's beneficial to do something physical, to dissipate the anger or the upset or the fear or the worry or the depression, the sadness of it. Because it's not easy to sit with strong emotions. So physical mindfulness can be very, very useful. So this is an aspect of the conditioning and how to free the mind of the conditioning. One more thing before we have to stop is desire itself. When you reflect on desire, you see actually it's very natural to have desire in the mind. The wanting mind is very, very natural. And it starts very young actually. When a baby becomes more active, more alert, say around 10 months, 9, 10, 11 months, and by then a child is learning to walk, you see that every interesting thing that they see, they reach out for it, right? Those who have had children can relate to this experience. They reach out for it because everything is interesting. And if you take something away from them or you prevent them from having something, that they want to hold on to, what happens? They cry, don't they? And interestingly enough, some adults behave the same way. They might not admit it, but they scream and shout. But then the habit, the grasping habit comes when a child begins to think more, to use language. And the moment a child says, I want something, I want this, instead of just reaching out. And you'll notice with a young child, when they're playing with something, after a few minutes, they let it go, right? They get bored with it and they look for something else that seems interesting. But when the child begins to think more, to speak more, then the mental identification, the mental grasping comes into the habitual response. And a young child begins to say, I want this thing. I must have it. And we carry that habit into adulthood. And of course, we think and believe that if I don't get what I want, or if I don't achieve what I want to achieve, it will be really awful. I'll be a big failure, etc., etc. You create an image of yourself too. So actually, it is not desire itself that is the problem, it's the identification with desire. When we grasp at it with I, with the self, I want this, I must have it. That is the source of the dukkha. Not the desire itself, but when we identify with it. Just like anger, when we identify with anger, then it becomes a problem. And you create an image also, I am an angry person, or I'm a jealous person. And then you start to beat yourself up. This is terrible, I'm such a bad Buddhist, or I'm such a bad meditator. I shouldn't be angry, or I shouldn't have craving. This is really bad, now I'll never become an arahant. Right? I'll never become, enlightened or a bodhisattva or whoever you want to become. Because that's a form of craving, you see. So this is one of the liberating aspects of seeing things as they are, without the grasping, the personal identification. Then we don't create an image of ourselves that's related to anger or craving or whatever it is, including the desire. And that's why it's very skillful when we can look at desire as just desire. There is craving. And you reflect on it, you remind yourself, this too shall pass. And it is uncertain. There's no guarantee, no certainty that what you get or what you will get is going to give you happiness. And sometimes it can give you more suffering. So sometimes suffering is not getting what you want, and sometimes suffering is getting what you want. And you're very disappointed. That's why there's a saying, be careful what you wish for, because you might get it. That's a good reflection. Yes. Now, at this time, are there any questions, any comments? Yes.
Bhante, just now you mentioned that thinking is a mental process from the past projecting to the future through the passage of time. We tend to think of time as an absolute dimension, but science has theorized that time is relative. So is there a Buddhist perspective towards how we perceive time and space?
Okay. First of all, I don't like to use that label, what is the Buddhist perspective?
All right.
Okay? Because sometimes people say, oh, Bhante, what is the Buddhist perspective on euthanasia? Or assisted suicide? And I said, in the Buddha's time, I don't think this issue came up. And there were no, machines and life-supporting machines during the Buddha's time. I just want to mention that. Yeah. There is natural time. Sunrise, sunset, full moon, midday sun, rainy season, dry season, and so on. And I got a taste of that life for 2 months up in northern India, where I just lived with natural time. And when you're living that life, and of course this was pre-internet days, so I didn't have to worry about, oh my God, I got to check email. I remember those good old days. I didn't have a watch, no schedule, and of course no mobile phone. And when you are living mindfully in that environment, moment-to-moment mindfulness becomes very easy. You can say effortless, because you're not in a hurry to do anything. Because you don't have all those outside factors, including schedules, of course. So when one is mindful, moment to moment, you begin to experience a timelessness. Because the present moment is actually timeless. But unless you're very calm, very relaxed, very present, the present moment and also its timeless dimension you cannot appreciate it. And you should know from your own experience, if you're in this busy world, you cannot really appreciate the present moment. Or you just see the present moment is something in which you have to achieve something. And if you don't have to achieve something, the mind says, I got to be doing something. Otherwise I'll be wasting time. People like to say that. And in North America they have the attitude, time is money. Time is money. Maybe it's the same now in Singapore. So you have to understand, once you understand the nature of thinking, you see how thinking is related to time. Past and future, right? You can see that. In other words, time itself, thought itself is time. Why? Because it's related to memory, things from the past, as I've just explained. And it's always projecting itself in the future. So that's why we're conditioned with this idea of time, it's because of thinking. And who I am, or who I think I am, is related to memories. All past experiences. And you see that fact more clearly, especially when you're meeting someone for the first time. And you naturally talk about yourselves, right? And when you talk about yourselves, what do you talk about? All your personal history, right? All your personal history. Very interesting, where you're born, family, education, etc., etc. And if you're in the working environment, you speak about your work history, including books you have read, movies you have seen, television programs you have watched, travel experiences, etc., etc. It's all based on memory. Actually, we're a collection of memories. When you say I, me, it's all based on memories. And because it is created by thinking itself, we project this I in the future, right? Future plans, hopes and dreams. You have certain ambitions, certain goals, and so on. That is the conditioning of the mind. And the awakening is that state of awareness, or Buddha nature. The Buddha nature is that aspect of the mind that can see all this. And that awareness is present moment awareness. It's timeless. You can say that the awareness you had as a child is the same awareness you have today. The only difference is that now you have more understanding, more wisdom. Whereas a young child doesn't have that understanding. And this is why when we enter that time, that silence, that stillness of the mind, we are in touch with that timeless dimension of the universe. Because we're a part of the universe. And the wonderful thing, we don't have to travel in outer space to experience this. We just have to go within. And just allow the mind to be still, and it is timeless. It becomes timeless. And when the mind is timeless, there is great peace and freedom from fear, anxiety, worry, and so on. Because time is an aspect of fear and also stress. I'm sure you've noticed that, right? Time is an aspect of stress. They're related. You have so much to do, and you only have certain amount of time. It's like if you go to one of these big shopping centers, and your mind is very, agitated and caught in craving. You thought, oh my goodness, there's so much to buy, and so little time. So much to buy, and so little money. Oh my God, what am I going to do? Life is suffering, you see? And this is why one of my favorite activities, when I'm not, sitting quietly, is to go to a shopping center and I look at everything without the eyes of wanting, without that element of desire. Having absolutely no desire to buy something, and then I can really enjoy looking at things. And it's all interesting. I remember in Hong Kong, I went into one of those stores that had all the watches, all the brand name watches around the world. And I remember looking at each watch, and I was so fascinated by all these brand name things. And all the models and the artistry and the beauty of them, and having absolutely no desire to buy one watch. Because I don't like to wear watches. And I realized that if I wanted to buy a watch, there'll be a lot of confusion and suffering. Right? Because then you have to decide, oh my God, so many watches, which one to choose. Right? And you find that when you have more choice, there's more conflict in the mind. I'm sure you've noticed that. Like going to one of those ice cream parlors. 50 flavors, oh my God, which one to choose? And your friend says, okay, you can choose 2 flavors out of 50. You can really see the suffering in the mind, the confusion in the mind. So, have I answered that question?
Yes.
Okay. Forget about the ice cream, okay? Yes, any other question? Or
Since we're out of time, maybe one last question, if there's any.
Yes.
Yeah, I think, Bhante, you mentioned a lot about thinking being the cause of a lot of suffering. So, what I want to know is that, is it generated by our brain, or is it rushed in from outside? Or is it a combination of both? And how do we reduce this thinking besides meditation and watching the breath, especially when we're in an office, in an environment where it's very fast moving and we tend to react? So is there any way to reduce the thinking and reaction in such a situation?
Yes. This morning, before the service at 10:30, I was showing the dynamic meditation where you can use your hands to focus. It's called dynamic meditation. From Thailand, Laos, they're teaching this. And you find that when you're in a very stressful environment or situation, you can't watch the mind just with the breath. You can focus on the hand movements. Or you can do the simple qigong, the balancing, where you raise your palms as you breathe in and breathe out. And you find that these dynamic practices of mindfulness are much easier to focus the mind, and you can let go of those thoughts. Yes, thinking is coming from the mind itself, from the frontal lobe of the mind. As I mentioned, there are actually electrical impulses. And the reason why the frontal lobe evolved to such an advanced state is because of the instinct for survival. The instinct for survival. So thinking itself has helped us a great deal in evolving as human beings to overcome a lot of difficulty in the natural and hostile world. So thinking has helped us a great deal, including modern science, medicine, and so on. But at the same time, it's the same thinking that's responsible for a lot of our mental, emotional suffering. Because we don't have the wisdom, the understanding, and we don't have the training, the mind training, to look at thoughts when they become obsessive, irrational, and let them go. Okay?
Thank you.
Okay, so we'll end for now, and I will continue this afternoon. So be well, be happy, be peaceful.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. You all pay respect to Bhante 3 times.